Welcome to a new true crime series where we take a dive into some of the most complex and notorious cases to have been seen in Sheffield. Presented by me, Harry Harrison, I will be joined by the editor of The Star, Claire Lewis, as she helps us break down the shocking assassination of a teenager that thrust the violent tit-for-tat postcode gang warfare in Sheffield into the national spotlight. This is the unsolved murder of Jonathan Matondo. Who was Jonathan and what happened to him, as far as we know?
So Jonathan was a 16-year-old boy who was shot dead in Sheffield, in the suburb of Burngreave. He came to Sheffield 10 years earlier from the Democratic Republic of Congo. Him and his family were trying to escape a civil war there. And it's ironic, really, that he ended up losing his life in a place where he was supposed to have been safe. So back in 2007, he was out in his neighbourhood, and he was shot by an unknown perpetrator on a recreation ground, shot from a distance of around 60 foot.
News broke. What happened that day?
So the murder happened at night. The first we heard about it was early doors the next morning. The early morning calls reporter picked it up. As a newsroom, we responded. We had a photographer at the scene, a couple of journalists, first on the scene. The Nationals made their way up a bit later on once the news had got out. We met the district commander of Sheffield up at the scene. He staged an impromptu press conference, such was the interest in the case. At that time, there were no reference made to the fact that this was a gangland feud killing. In those very early days, the police placed a lot of emphasis on the fact that Jonathan was a member of a local church, that he had wanted to become a preacher, and that was the line that ourselves and the Nationals used initially. The shock horror that this teenage boy who dreamt of a career in the church had been tragically killed. It later emerged, after talking to local residents, police officers, doing our own background research, it soon emerged that he may have been a member of the church, but he also had a different side to him. Jonathan was known on the streets as Venemous. He was known to have carried a gun and a blade. He had a previous criminal record. He was known to the police. That doesn't in any way, shape or form justify what happened to him at all. It was absolutely appalling. But I'm just trying to put into context what we were dealing with back then. We were dealing with two inner city gangs, retribution attacks, tit-for-tat attacks, guns being fired recklessly at each other, at homes, and unfortunately it culminated in the death of a 16-year-old boy.
So this is where Jonathan's body was found, isn't it?
It was back in 2007 on the Nottingham Cliff recreation area in the middle of Burngreave, where children played day after day. Jonathan was here with his friends that night. His mum had gone to church. Jonathan had said he was going to the park. There'd been an incident earlier in the day where shots had been fired at Jonathan. Those shots missed him. Tragically, he was gunned down here. The police believe from a distance of around 60 feet, quite a considerable distance, probably the length of a basketball pitch, which is where Jonathan's body was found. On the day of the murder, this entire area, vast area, was cordoned off with police tape. There were police officers surrounding the recreation ground. There were armed police officers, loads of them patrolling the streets, driving around the streets. You couldn't get anywhere near for days. Eventually, when the park was reopened, this area here became a shrine. There were candles, floral tributes. All Jonathan's friends gathered here. The community came here in absolute shock at what had happened. And now as we look around the place today, 14, 15 years later, there's no tribute here, no formal tribute, but there's street art where Jonathan's name is enshrined on walls, on a piece of furniture on the park. You can be rest assured that he has never been forgotten in this area, and he never will be.
Gangland warfare, I guess, between S3 and S4 wasn't really public knowledge at the time. It wasn't a big story in Sheffield at the time, was it?
That's right. So it was not until Jonathan's murder that the S3, S4 feud became common knowledge. It was common knowledge in Burngreave and Pittsmore, you know, residents living along it, you know, houses being shot at in their street. But for the man on the street elsewhere in Sheffield, they were unaware of it. What we did find strange was that when we went up to Burngreave in the immediate aftermath of the murder, residents up there were shocked because a young boy had died, but they weren't surprised. It was almost like this feud had been leading up to this. Unfortunately, this murder wasn't the last in this feud. There's been more incidents since then.
With these gangs in different areas of different cities and stuff like that, I think one of the things that is often shocking every time, no matter where in the country we have an incident like this, is the age of the people involved. What was the reaction, if you remember, to a teenager being shot in such a brutal way?
Back then people were horrified. You know, as a young child, 16-year-old, just left school, horrified that he could be killed like this. The police said at the time that they did think it was a targeted attack, that it was a ruthless and planned attack, but that was way after the initial press conference at the crime scene, where they just gave us the basics.
Sheffield was regarded as one of the safest cities in the country at that point, so it would have been a shock nationally for this sort of incident to take place.
It was. Sheffield had a reputation as one of the safest cities in the country, so this sent shockwaves across Sheffield, but also across the country. The Nationals, they were straight up here. You know, they wanted to know, you know, what had gone wrong, who was to blame, what was happening in Sheffield, what was changing, why was it changing. There were a lot of questions that needed answered.
What was, because obviously nobody's ever been convicted of Jonathan's murder, and so we don't have the usual, this is what happened, that we can use when somebody's been convicted in court, but police have their suspicions and a timeline of what they believe has happened as to why and what happened. So what was that sort of belief and suspicions from the police?
Yeah, so one teenager stood trial twice over this murder. The first time the jury could not reach a verdict. The second time he was acquitted. But throughout both trials and to this day, the police belief is that Jonathan was killed in a retribution attack for previous incidents involving the S3 and S4 gang. The police claim that they have evidence that on the day of Jonathan's murder, there was another attempt on his life. He was shot at again. On that occasion, he wasn't hit. And the police believe that that was all to do with the fact that the night before, a gun was fired at an S4 member's relative's house. So that's what they believe is at the root of this murder.
So where are the police at regarding this case?
Well, cases of this severity are never closed. There is a cold case review team at South Yorkshire Police. They examine unsolved murders, rapes, other serious cases. Should any new information ever come to light, they'll obviously investigate it. These cases are reviewed on a regular basis, and the police have always said that they never thought that just one person was responsible for this murder. They've always thought there was a group involved. So the potential is that eventually, one day, numerous people could eventually be brought to justice.
Jonathan's family may have moved away from Sheffield, but their son will never be forgotten, and hopefully one day they will see justice be served.